At exactly 6:12 a.m., Ethan Cole sat in the back of a black luxury SUV parked beneath rain-heavy maple trees in Chicago, watching a woman walk alone through a storm. The rain wasn't dramatic enough for the news. No thunder, no lightning, just endless cold rain that soaked through jackets, shoes, and hope. The kind of weather that made most people stay home if they had the choice. But the woman walking down the cracked sidewalk clearly didn't have one. Her name was Rachel Bennett, 29 years old, single mother, unemployed for 14 months, one daughter, no car, no savings, one final interview that could change everything. And Ethan Cole, the billionaire founder of Cole Freight Systems, was watching her from behind tinted glass, not helping, just watching, because Ethan no longer trusted words. 8 years earlier, his closest business partner had stolen millions from him using fake invoices and shell companies. Since then, Ethan believed resumes were performances, interviews were rehearsals, and promises were cheap. The only thing that mattered was behavior, when nobody thought they were being judged. That was why he personally observed final candidates before interviews. Most people never knew. Some candidates yelled at baristas. Some lied to Uber drivers. Some showed up late and blamed traffic. But Rachel stepped over a puddle with worn-out sneakers already soaked through. In one hand, she carried a pair of black heels. In the other, a plastic grocery bag protecting her resume from the rain. No umbrella, no ride, no complaints, just movement. Ethan leaned slightly forward inside the SUV. "Follow her," he told his driver quietly. The SUV rolled slowly behind her through the streets of Chicago's South Side. Rachel had already been awake since 4:15 a.m., not because of an alarm. Fear woke her every morning. Fear of bills. Fear of rejection emails. Fear that her 6-year-old daughter, Lily Bennett, would eventually notice how often their refrigerator looked empty. Rachel had left Lily sleeping at the apartment of their elderly neighbor, Margaret Hayes, who had taken them in after eviction 3 months earlier. The bus route downtown had been canceled because of flooding. Uber cost $23. Rachel had $7.12 in her bank account, so she walked 6 miles in November rain toward a building filled with executives who would probably reject her like everyone else. Still, she kept moving. Her navy blazer, bought from a thrift store in Toronto during better years, clung heavily to her shoulders. Water dripped from her sleeves. Every few steps her shoes made a wet squishing sound against the pavement. But the documents inside the plastic bag stayed dry. That mattered more. 2 miles into the walk, a speeding SUV splashed dirty water across her legs. Rachel stopped. For 3 seconds, she stood completely still in the rain. Not crying, not yelling, just exhausted. Then she checked the plastic bag. The resume was still dry. She nodded once to herself and continued walking. Inside the luxury SUV, Ethan stared at her silently. His coffee had gone cold. "She's still walking," he muttered. His driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir, should we offer her a ride?" "No." The answer came too quickly. But even Ethan noticed something uncomfortable in his own voice. Because this wasn't a test anymore. It was beginning to feel like cruelty. Still, Rachel walked. By the 4th mile, her fingers were numb from cold. That was when her phone rang. "Mama?" Lily's small voice came through the speaker. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. "Hey, baby. Is it raining?" Rachel looked at the dark sky. "Just a little." "You're going to get the job," Lily said confidently. "I know it." Rachel pressed her lips together hard enough to stop them shaking. "I'm trying my best. I put the note in your pocket." Rachel touched the folded piece of paper inside her blazer. 5 purple crayon words. "You got this, Mommy." Rachel smiled despite herself. "I love you bigger than the sky," Lily whispered. Rachel swallowed hard. "I love you bigger than the sky and every star in it." The call ended. Rachel stepped back into the storm, and for the first time that morning, she walked faster. 3 blocks away, Ethan Cole sat frozen inside heated leather seats, staring at a woman who refused to surrender even when life had already taken nearly everything from her. And somewhere deep inside him, a memory he had buried for 30 years began to wake up. His mother, walking home from factory shifts in freezing Detroit snow because they couldn't afford a car, wet shoes beside the radiator, exhaustion hidden behind a smile. Ethan tightened his jaw. For the first time in years, the billionaire who trusted no one was beginning to wonder if he had forgotten what real strength looked like. And ahead of Rachel, towering above downtown Chicago, stood the glass headquarters of Coal Freight Systems. She had no idea the man secretly watching her from behind tinted windows was the CEO of the company. She had no idea he would soon sit across from her in the interview room. And she definitely had no idea that before this day ended, one impossible decision would force Ethan Cole to choose between protecting his empire or finally opening his heart again. The glass headquarters of Coal Freight Systems towered above downtown Chicago like a monument built for people who had never worried about rent. Rainwater dripped from Rachel Bennett's soaked blazer as she stood outside the revolving doors trying to steady her breathing. Her feet ached from walking 6 miles through freezing November rain. Every muscle in her body felt heavy, but she had made it. 8:51 a.m., 9 minutes early. Rachel stared at her reflection in the glass doors for a brief moment. Wet hair, pale lips, exhausted eyes. Not exactly the image of success. Still, she pushed the doors open and stepped inside. Warm air hit her instantly. The marble lobby glowed under crystal lights. Executives in tailored suits crossed the floor carrying expensive coffees, while polished shoes clicked softly against the tiles. Rachel suddenly became painfully aware of the wet footprints she was leaving behind. She lowered her gaze and walked quickly toward the restroom. Inside, she locked herself into a stall and finally allowed herself one deep breath. Then she got to work. She removed the soaked running shoes and carefully slipped on her black office heels. She wrung rainwater from her navy blazer into the sink until it stopped dripping. Using paper towels, she dried her face and smoothed her dark chestnut hair back into a neat low bun. Finally, she opened the plastic bag. Her resume was perfect, dry, not a single wrinkle. Rachel smiled weakly. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "You survived the walk. Now survive the interview." She touched the folded purple note inside her blazer pocket. "You got this, Mommy." That tiny message from Lily Bennett somehow gave her more strength than food ever could. 10 minutes later, Rachel sat in the 4th-floor waiting room beside 3 other candidates. All of them looked polished. Expensive watches, luxury handbags, perfect hair, perfect confidence, and completely dry. Rachel sat quietly in the second chair from the door, holding her resume folder tightly against her lap. A younger man in a fitted gray designer suit glanced at her wet blazer and smirked. "Wow!" he muttered loudly to the woman beside him. "Did she swim here?" The woman laughed quietly. Rachel heard every word, but she didn't react. Not because it didn't hurt, because she was too tired to waste energy defending herself anymore. Instead, she calmly reviewed her resume again while pretending nobody else existed. That silence unsettled the room more than anger would have. A few moments later, the receptionist approached. Janice Miller was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She stopped beside Rachel, holding a cup of steaming black coffee. "This is for you, honey." Rachel blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry, who sent it?" Janice smiled softly. "They didn't say." Rachel wrapped both trembling hands around the cup. Warmth spread through her frozen fingers almost instantly. And suddenly, after months of rejection emails, overdue bills, eviction notices, and unanswered prayers, one simple act of kindness nearly broke her. "Thank you," she whispered, across the lobby security cameras. High above the building, Ethan Cole watched silently from his private office. He had told himself the coffee meant nothing, but somehow it meant everything. Because it was the first compassionate thing he had done for a stranger in nearly a decade. Rachel recognized him immediately from the giant portrait downstairs. Ethan Cole, the billionaire founder, the owner of the building, the man whose company controlled thousands of freight routes across North America. And now he was walking directly toward the empty chair beside them. Ethan sat down calmly and folded his hands. His gray eyes locked onto Rachel's. Not cold, not warm, just searching. "Ms. Bennett," he said quietly. "I have one question." Rachel swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Ethan leaned slightly forward. "Why didn't you reschedule when you saw the storm this morning?" The room froze. Rachel stared at him. At the billionaire whose watch probably cost more than her yearly rent. At the man who could never possibly understand what it meant to choose between walking through freezing rain or losing your last chance at survival. But she answered honestly anyway. "Because opportunities don't wait for people like me." The words left the room completely still. Rachel continued softly. "I've spent 14 months here, no. The bus got canceled. I couldn't afford a ride, but I could walk." Her voice trembled slightly now. "So I walked." Ethan said nothing, but something behind his eyes shifted, because suddenly he wasn't seeing Rachel Bennett anymore. He was seeing his own mother decades earlier, walking through Detroit snow after factory shifts because missing work wasn't an option when poverty was waiting at home. For the first time in years, the billionaire who believed words were worthless realized he had just heard something completely real. And in that exact moment, everything about this interview changed. Rachel Bennett arrived at Coal Freight Systems 40 minutes early on her first day, not because anyone told her to, because being late felt dangerous when life had finally given her one fragile opportunity. The November sky over Chicago was still dark when she stepped off a city bus wearing the same navy blazer she had walked 6 miles in days earlier. Only now it was freshly pressed, carefully repaired at the sleeve, and carrying hope instead of desperation. Inside her apartment, Lily Bennett had hugged her tightly before school. "You're a business lady now," Lily had whispered proudly. Rachel smiled just remembering it. For the first time in months, she felt like maybe life was finally turning around. But the moment she stepped onto the operations floor of Coal Freight Systems, she felt it immediately. The silence, not obvious, not loud, just subtle enough to hurt. People glanced at her, then looked away. Some smiled politely. Others didn't smile at all. Because news traveled fast inside billion-dollar companies, especially rumors connected to the CEO. Everyone knew Ethan Cole had personally hired her, and nobody understood why. Rachel tried to ignore it. She focused on orientation instead. New employee badge, software training, routing systems, vendor communication protocols. Everything moved quickly, too quickly. The company's logistics software looked like an entirely different language compared to the outdated systems she used before. By lunchtime, Rachel already felt overwhelmed, but she refused to let anyone see it, especially not Victor Hale. Victor watched her constantly during meetings, not openly hostile, just observant in a way that made her nervous, like he was waiting for proof she didn't belong there. And honestly, Rachel feared he might be right. Later that afternoon, she accidentally submitted a routing update using an outdated shipment template. A small mistake, easily corrected. But Victor noticed immediately. "This isn't Lakeview Distribution," he said flatly in front of the team. "Details matter here." Rachel felt heat rush into her face. "I'm sorry. I'll fix it." Victor gave a short nod. "See that you do." The room stayed awkwardly silent afterward. Rachel quietly returned to her desk, fighting humiliation. Around her, keyboards clicked while conversations resumed like nothing had happened. But inside her chest, old fears returned instantly. "You don't belong here. You'll fail. They made a mistake hiring you." By 7:15 p.m., most employees had already gone home. Rachel remained at her desk, reviewing freight reports alone beneath fluorescent lights. She still didn't fully understand the routing system, so she stayed, learning, studying, refusing to fall behind. That was when a voice interrupted softly behind her. "You're still here." Rachel turned quickly. It was Ethan Cole. Without the crowded boardroom around him, he somehow looked different, less intimidating, still powerful, but quieter somehow. Rachel stood immediately. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just reviewing the system." Ethan glanced at the multiple spreadsheets open on her monitor. "You made one mistake today," he said calmly. Rachel lowered her eyes. "Yes, sir. And yet you stayed 3 hours late correcting it." She looked back up slowly. Ethan folded his hands behind his back while studying the operations floor. "When I built this company," he said quietly, I slept in truck stops and learned accounting from library books because I couldn't afford college. Rachel stared at him surprised. Nobody ever talked about billionaires struggling. Not publicly. Ethan continued. People assume successful companies are built by genius. A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. They're usually built by terrified people refusing to quit. Rachel felt something inside her chest loosen slightly, because for the first time since arriving, someone understood how hard she was trying. Ethan looked toward her computer screen again. You're learning faster than you think. Rachel almost laughed softly. It doesn't feel that way. It never does in the beginning. Their eyes met briefly, and once again that strange understanding passed silently between them. Not romance. Something deeper. Recognition. Two survivors from completely different worlds. Suddenly footsteps approached from down the hallway. Victor. He stopped immediately upon seeing Rachel alone with Ethan. For one brief second, surprise flashed across his face. Then professionalism returned instantly. Mr. Cole, Victor said carefully. Ethan turned calmly. Victor. Victor glanced toward Rachel's workstation. She's still here? Rachel felt embarrassed immediately. I was reviewing the system after my mistake. Victor nodded once. At least she's taking responsibility. The comment sounded polite, but something underneath it felt sharp. Ethan noticed too. She'll learn the system. Ethan said calmly. Victor adjusted the folder in his hands. I hope so. This department moves fast. Then Victor looked directly at Rachel. Some people adapt quicker than others. Rachel understood exactly what he meant, and Ethan clearly did too. The air between the two men tightened almost invisibly. Finally, Ethan spoke. Ms. Bennett. Rachel straightened slightly. Yes, sir? Go home. She blinked. You've been here 12 hours. Rachel looked embarrassed again. I just didn't want to fall behind. Ethan's expression softened almost invisibly. You won't survive here if you confuse exhaustion with dedication. That sentence stayed with Rachel long after she left the building. Outside, freezing wind swept through downtown Chicago as she waited for the evening bus beneath glowing streetlights. For the first time in months, she felt proud of herself. Not secure, not safe, but proud. Upstairs in his office, Ethan stood silently beside the windows overlooking the city. Behind him, Victor remained near the doorway. You hired her emotionally, Victor finally said. Ethan didn't turn around. No. Victor crossed his arms. She's inexperienced. She's distracted. And eventually personal problems become company problems. Still, Ethan remained silent. Victor continued carefully. You built this company on discipline, not sympathy. At that, Ethan finally turned, and Victor immediately sensed something dangerous beneath the calm expression. You think I hired her because I pity her? Ethan asked quietly. Victor hesitated. I think hardship can make people unreliable. Ethan walked slowly toward him. Or, he said softly, hardship reveals who people really are. Victor said nothing, because suddenly he realized something unsettling. This wasn't just about Rachel Bennett anymore. Somehow, the woman from the rainstorm was changing Ethan Cole himself. And deep down, Victor wasn't sure that change would be good for the company. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Rachel sat alone on the bus staring at Chicago lights through fog glass. She touched the folded purple note, still hidden inside her blazer pocket. You got this, Mommy. Rachel smiled tiredly. What she didn't know was that upstairs inside Coal Freight Systems, people had already started questioning whether she deserved the job at all. And before long, someone would try to prove she never belonged there in the first place. For the next 3 weeks, Rachel Bennett worked harder than anyone on the operations floor of Coal Freight Systems. Earlier than everyone. Home later than everyone. She studied freight systems during lunch breaks, reviewed shipment logs on a bus ride home, and memorized routing codes while cooking dinner for Lily Bennett. Slowly, she improved. The mistakes became smaller. The fear became quieter. Even some co-workers had started warming up to her. Not everyone, but enough. Still, Victor Hale continued watching her closely. Too closely. Rachel noticed it during meetings. Whenever she spoke, Victor questioned details twice as hard as everyone else. Whenever another employee made an error, corrections stayed private. But when Rachel made one, the room always heard about it. At first, she thought maybe she was imagining it. Then came Monday morning, 8:17 a.m. A freight shipment containing medical equipment worth nearly $2 million disappeared somewhere between Illinois and Michigan. Phones exploded across the operations department. Regional managers shouted over speaker calls. Drivers demanded updated routes. Clients threatened legal action. And suddenly, every executive on the floor was moving at once. Rachel sat frozen at her desk, reviewing shipment logs repeatedly. Something wasn't right. The tracking data showed conflicting reroutes entered under her employee credentials. Her stomach dropped. "No," she whispered. Victor appeared beside her desk almost instantly. "Problem, Ms. Bennett?" Rachel looked up anxiously. "These reroute authorizations. I didn't submit them." Victor extended his hand. "Let me see." Rachel passed him the tablet. Victor reviewed the screen carefully. Then his expression darkened. "These credentials are yours." Rachel's pulse started racing. "I know, but I didn't make those changes." Several nearby employees were already listening now. Rachel felt panic rising rapidly inside her chest. Victor looked coldly professional. "A $2 million shipment is currently missing." "I understand that," Rachel said quickly. "But I didn't reroute anything." Victor's voice lowered. "Then explain why the system says otherwise." Rachel opened her mouth. Nothing came out, because she had no explanation. And deep down, she suddenly understood exactly how fragile her new life really was. One mistake, one accusation, and everything could disappear again. Within 20 minutes, Rachel was sitting inside a private conference room with human resources. Rain hammered the windows outside, while paperwork spread across the table before her like evidence in a criminal trial. Patricia Holland sat quietly reviewing reports. Victor stood near the windows with folded arms. Rachel's hands trembled beneath the table. "I didn't do this," she whispered again. Victor finally turned around. "Ms. Bennett, your employee credentials were used at 11:42 p.m. Sunday night." Rachel frowned immediately. "Sunday?" Patricia looked up. "Yes." Rachel shook her head quickly. "I wasn't even here Sunday." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Can anyone confirm that?" Rachel almost laughed from disbelief. "I was home with my daughter." Victor remained expressionless. "Do you have proof?" The question hit her like a slap. Proof? Single mothers living paycheck to paycheck didn't document every second of survival. Rachel felt humiliation burn through her chest. "I don't know what you want me to say." Victor slid a printed report across the table. "Until the shipment is located, this situation is extremely serious." Rachel stared at the paper, without seeing it clearly anymore, because fear was taking over now. Real fear, the kind that made breathing difficult. Not just losing a job, losing stability, losing rent money, losing Lily's future again. Suddenly the conference room door opened. Ethan Cole entered quietly. The atmosphere changed immediately. Victor straightened. Patricia looked relieved. Rachel looked terrified. Ethan took one glance at her face and instantly understood something important. This woman wasn't pretending. Fear like this couldn't be faked. "What do we know?" Ethan asked calmly. Victor explained the shipment reroute issue quickly and professionally. Then he handed Ethan the report. Ethan reviewed it silently. Finally, he looked toward Rachel. "Did you authorize these reroutes?" Rachel met his eyes directly despite trembling. No hesitation, no performance, just honesty. Ethan believed her immediately, and that unsettled him, because belief wasn't something he gave easily anymore. Victor noticed. "With respect," Victor said carefully, "the system evidence is clear." Ethan continued studying the report, then suddenly asked, "What time was the reroute entered?" Victor glanced down. 11:42 p.m. Ethan looked back at Rachel. "Where were you?" Rachel swallowed hard. "At home helping Lily with a school project." "What project?" Rachel blinked from surprise. "A solar system model." Victor looked irritated now. Ethan continued calmly. "What planet?" Rachel frowned slightly. Saturn. Why Saturn? Because Lily likes the rings. Silence. Victor looked confused by the questions, but Ethan wasn't asking randomly. He was watching Rachel carefully, and every answer came instantly, naturally, truthfully, no manufactured details. Meanwhile, Victor kept relying only on reports. Finally, Ethan placed the file down slowly. Pull security footage. Victor hesitated. The login came from her credentials. I didn't ask about credentials. The room went silent. Ethan's gray eyes hardened slightly now. I asked for footage. 30 minutes later, the truth exploded across the operations department. Security cameras revealed another employee using Rachel's workstation after hours Sunday night, a senior logistics coordinator named Darren Pike, the same employee Rachel had unknowingly reported 2 weeks earlier for falsifying delivery times. Darren had accessed her login information while helping train her after hours. Then he used her credentials to hide unauthorized reroutes connected to side payments from a third-party vendor. Rachel sat speechless inside the conference room while investigators confirmed everything. Victor looked stunned. Patricia looked horrified. And Ethan looked furious. Not because of the fraud. Because Rachel had nearly been destroyed by people too ready to believe the worst about struggling women. Victor finally spoke carefully. It appears Ms. Bennett was framed. Appears. Rachel almost laughed bitterly at the wording. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. No, he said quietly. She was targeted. The room fell silent again, because everyone understood what he truly meant. Rachel had been seen as vulnerable, disposable, easy to blame, and someone had counted on that. Rachel stared down at the table, trying to steady herself. But the adrenaline crash finally hit. Her breathing became shaky. Her eyes filled instantly, not because she was weak, because surviving constant fear eventually exhausts even strong people. Without thinking, Ethan stepped closer and placed a suit jacket gently around her shoulders. The room froze. Rachel looked up at him stunned, and for one brief second, the billionaire CEO and the struggling single mother stood in complete silence, while everyone else watched something neither of them fully understood yet. Not romance. Something more dangerous. Trust. Real trust. Victor saw it immediately, and deep inside, for the first time since Rachel Bennett entered the company, Victor Hale became afraid, because suddenly he realized something that could change everything inside Cole Freight Systems. Ethan Cole wasn't just protecting Rachel anymore. He was beginning to care about her, and caring made powerful men unpredictable. After the investigation exposed Darren Pike, the atmosphere inside Cole Freight Systems changed overnight. People looked at Rachel Bennett differently now, some with sympathy, others with guilt, a few with admiration, because surviving humiliation without collapsing had quietly earned respect. But Rachel didn't feel victorious. She felt exhausted, emotionally exhausted. For weeks, she had lived with constant fear of failure. Then suddenly she had almost lost everything because someone decided she was weak enough to blame. Even after being proven innocent, the anxiety remained trapped inside her chest like ice. 3 days later, Rachel sat alone at her workstation long after sunset, staring blankly at shipment data she could barely focus on. Outside the skyscraper windows, snow drifted softly across downtown Chicago. The operations floor was nearly empty. Most employees had already gone home. Rachel rubbed her tired eyes and checked the time. 8:46 p.m. Too late. Again. She immediately grabbed her phone to text Margaret Hayes. Running late. Is Lily asleep? The reply came seconds later. She tried staying awake for you. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. Guilt hit instantly. Ever since starting this job, she had spent less time with Lily, less bedtime stories, less dinners together, less laughter. She told herself it was temporary, necessary. Still, it hurt. You missed dinner again. Rachel startled and looked up. Ethan Cole stood near her desk holding 2 paper takeout bags, without his suit jacket and tie. He somehow looked less like a billionaire and more like a tired man carrying too much responsibility. Rachel immediately stood. I'm sorry. I didn't realize anyone else was still here. Ethan glanced at the untouched coffee beside her keyboard. You've been staring at the same screen for 12 minutes. Rachel looked embarrassed. I was just reviewing freight patterns. No, Ethan said quietly. You were overthinking. That answer caught her off guard, because it was true. Ethan placed one takeout bag on her desk. You can't solve problems on an empty stomach. Rachel hesitated. You really don't have to. I know. The simplicity of his answer made her stop talking. Slowly, she sat back down. The smell of warm chicken soup filled the quiet operations floor, and suddenly Rachel realized how hungry she actually was. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Snow continued falling outside, while distant city lights reflected against the glass walls around them. Finally, Ethan spoke quietly. When I was 14, my mother worked double shifts at a packaging factory. Rachel looked up. Ethan rarely talked about himself. She used to fall asleep at the kitchen table sometimes while helping me with homework. A faint sadness crossed his face. I remember being angry at her for always being tired. Rachel listened silently. Then one night, Ethan continued, I woke up and realized she had fallen asleep still wearing her work boots. He looked down briefly. That was the first time I understood survival can exhaust good people. The room became very quiet. Rachel swallowed softly. My daughter notices when I'm tired now. Ethan looked toward her. She's 6, Rachel whispered, and she already notices. Her voice cracked slightly. That shouldn't happen so early. Ethan studied her silently, because beneath Rachel's professionalism, he could finally see the truth clearly. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She was afraid of failing the one person who depended on her most. That fear was different, more painful, more human. You're doing better than you think, Ethan said quietly. Rachel laughed softly without humor. I almost got fired 2 weeks ago. You were framed, but it still happened. Ethan leaned slightly against the edge of the desk. Do you know why I trusted you immediately? Rachel shook her head slowly. Because people who fight the hard to survive usually don't risk everything carelessly. Rachel stared at him. Nobody had ever described her struggle like that before. Not as weakness, as evidence of character. For the first time in years, Rachel felt truly seen, and that terrified her a little, because emotionally dangerous people weren't always cruel. Sometimes they were simply kind when your heart had forgotten kindness existed. Suddenly Rachel's phone rang. Lily. Rachel answered immediately. Hey, baby. Mama? Lily's sleepy voice whispered through the speaker. Miss Margaret made hot chocolate. Rachel smiled instantly. That sounded amazing. Did you eat dinner? Rachel glanced briefly at Ethan and the takeout containers. Yes. Good. Lily yawned loudly, then asked softly, Are you coming home soon? The question broke something inside Rachel immediately, because no matter how important this job became, nothing mattered more than that little voice waiting for her every night. I'm leaving now, Rachel promised gently. Okay, Lily whispered. I love you bigger than the sky. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. I love you bigger than every star in it. The call ended. Silence returned. But something had shifted in the room. Ethan looked away toward the snowy skyline, because hearing Rachel speak to her daughter awakened an ache he rarely allowed himself to feel anymore. Regret, not for money, not for business, for time. Years spent building an empire, while relationships quietly disappeared around him. Finally, Rachel gathered her things. I should go. Ethan nodded once, then suddenly asked, Do you have transportation home? Rachel hesitated. The bus. Ethan glanced outside at the snowstorm growing heavier. At this hour? I'll be okay. But Ethan already knew she wouldn't. Chicago buses became unreliable during storms, and parts of the South Side were dangerous late at night. Without another word, Ethan picked up his coat. I'll drive you. Rachel froze instantly. Oh no, I couldn't possibly ask. You didn't. Their eyes met, and once again that strange emotional tension filled the space between them. Not romance. Not yet. Something quieter. Two lonely people beginning to trust each other despite themselves. 20 minutes later, Rachel sat nervously inside Ethan's black luxury SUV, while snow blurred across the windows outside. The heated leather seats felt unreal compared to the freezing buses she normally took home. Neither spoke much during the drive, but somehow the silence felt comfortable, safe, until the SUV finally turned onto Rachel's neighborhood street. And everything changed, because outside Margaret Hayes' apartment building, red and blue police lights flashed violently against the snow. Rachel's entire body went cold. Before the vehicle fully stopped, she was already reaching for the door, and then she saw it, Lily Bennett standing outside the apartment, crying beside two police officers. The moment Rachel Bennett saw the flashing police lights outside Margaret Hayes' apartment building, her entire world stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Her breathing vanished instantly, and all she could see was Lily Bennett crying beneath falling snow. Rachel threw the SUV door open before Ethan Cole could even react. Lily! Her heels slipped against icy pavement as she ran across the street. Lily turned immediately. Mommy! The little girl burst into tears and sprinted toward her. Rachel dropped to her knees and pulled Lily tightly into her arms, so fast it almost knocked them both into the snow. Oh my God! Oh my God! Rachel's voice shook violently as she searched Lily's face desperately for injuries. Are you hurt? Lily, baby, are you hurt? Lily cried harder and buried her face against Rachel's shoulder. No! Rachel held her tighter. Behind them, two police officers exchanged quiet glances, while Margaret Hayes stood near the apartment entrance wrapped in a winter coat and looking pale. Ethan approached slowly from the SUV. Instantly the officers recognized him, but Ethan ignored their surprised expressions completely. His attention remained fixed on Rachel, because he had never seen fear look that raw before. One of the officers stepped forward carefully. Ma'am, your daughter's okay. Rachel looked up immediately. What happened? Margaret answered first, still shaken. There was a fire in the apartment downstairs. Rachel froze. Smoke. Lily. Old apartment building. Her mind immediately imagined the worst possible outcome. Margaret continued quickly. It started in the laundry room. Small electrical fire. The firefighters controlled it fast. Rachel's breathing remained uneven, but the smoke spread through the hallways. One officer nodded. The building's being temporarily evacuated while inspectors checked the wiring. Rachel looked around, finally noticing residents standing outside in winter coats, while emergency vehicles blocked the street. Snow continued falling heavily around them. Then the reality of the situation hit her fully. They couldn't go back inside tonight. No apartment, no clothes, no place to sleep. Rachel closed her eyes briefly as panic rose all over again. Not now. Please, not now. Lily looked up at her nervously. Mommy, are we going to lose another home? The question shattered Rachel completely, because children should never have to ask things like that. Rachel forced herself to smile despite tears filling her eyes. No, baby. But her voice trembled badly. No, we're okay. Except she had absolutely no idea if that was true. Margaret stepped closer apologetically. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. They said it could take a couple days before we're allowed back in. Rachel nodded slowly while trying to think. Hotels cost money. Friends had disappeared months ago when hardship became inconvenient. Shelters were overcrowded during winter. And suddenly the terrifying instability she thought she escaped came rushing back toward her all over again. That was when Ethan spoke quietly behind her. They'll stay at the Lakeview Suites tonight. Rachel turned immediately. What? Ethan remained calm. I own the property. Rachel shook her head instantly. No, I couldn't possibly. You can. The answer came gently, firmly. Rachel looked embarrassed immediately. I appreciate it, but I don't want charity. Ethan's expression softened slightly. This isn't charity. Snowflakes settled across his dark overcoat as he continued. It's a warm room for a child during a snowstorm. The simplicity of the statement left Rachel speechless, because deep down, she knew refusing would only come from pride, and pride didn't keep children safe at night. Still, she hesitated. Years of survival had taught her dangerous lessons about accepting help. Help usually came with conditions, eventually. Disappointment eventually. People eventually. Ethan seemed to understand her hesitation immediately. You don't owe me anything, he said quietly. Their eyes met beneath flashing emergency lights. And for the first time, Rachel believed him. 30 minutes later, the black SUV pulled beneath the glowing entrance of the Lakeview Suites in downtown Chicago. Lily stared wide-eyed through the window. "Mommy," Rachel looked over. "There's a fountain inside." Ethan almost smiled hearing the amazement in her voice. The hotel lobby looked like another universe compared to the apartment building they had just left behind. Golden chandeliers, warm marble floors, soft piano music. Rachel immediately felt out of place. She tightened her grip on Lily's hand instinctively. At the front desk, employees straightened nervously the moment they recognized Ethan Cole entering the lobby. "Good evening, Mr. Cole." Ethan nodded once. Presidential suite, 2 connecting rooms. Rachel's eyes widened instantly. "Oh no, absolutely not." Ethan glanced toward her calmly. "You need rest tonight." "I don't need a presidential suite." Lily tugged Rachel's sleeve gently. "What's presidential mean?" Rachel closed her eyes briefly in embarrassment. Ethan crouched slightly beside Lily. "It means extra pancakes at breakfast." Lily gasped dramatically. Rachel actually laughed for the first time all night. A real laugh. Soft, beautiful. And Ethan unexpectedly felt something shift painfully inside his chest hearing it, because he realized something dangerous in that moment. He wanted to protect that sound. Upstairs, the suite looked larger than Rachel's entire apartment floor. Lily immediately ran toward the giant windows overlooking snowy Chicago lights. "Mommy, look." Rachel stood near the doorway, overwhelmed. Everything felt surreal. Too clean, too warm, too temporary. Ethan noticed the uncertainty still written across her face. "You're safe here tonight." Rachel looked at him quietly. Safe. She honestly couldn't remember the last time someone made her feel that word instead of simply saying it. Lily suddenly climbed onto the couch, holding a hotel menu. Excitedly, "They have chocolate cake." Rachel laughed softly again. "We are not ordering chocolate cake at midnight." Lily grinned mischievously. "What about 12:01? Even Ethan smiled this time, and Rachel noticed. For one brief second, the billionaire who intimidated entire boardrooms looked almost human, almost lonely. Then Ethan's phone buzzed sharply. The expression on his face changed instantly after reading the message. Cold again. Controlled again. Rachel noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" Ethan locked the screen quietly. "No." Something in his voice made the room suddenly tense. Then he looked directly at Rachel. "Tomorrow morning," he said carefully, "there's something happening at the company you need to be prepared for." Rachel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated, and that hesitation alone terrified her, because powerful men only looked uncertain when something serious was coming. Finally he spoke. "The board of directors found out about Darren Pike." Rachel's stomach tightened. "And?" Ethan's gray eyes darkened slightly. "And someone's using the situation to question my leadership." Rachel stared at him silently. Then Ethan said the one sentence that changed everything. "They're demanding I terminate you." The room went completely still. Even Lily slowly lowered the hotel menu. And suddenly Rachel understood something horrifying. The storm threatening her life was never really over. It had only just begun. The next morning, snow covered downtown Chicago in icy white silence. But inside coal freight systems, war had already begun. Rachel Bennett sat quietly in the backseat of Ethan Cole's black SUV while the city blurred past the windows. The heater hummed softly. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Not after last night. Not after Ethan revealed the board wanted her fired. Rachel stared down at her trembling hands. "This is my fault," she whispered finally. Ethan turned toward her immediately. "No, they're attacking you because of me." "They're attacking me," Ethan corrected calmly, "because powerful people panic when control starts slipping." Rachel shook her head softly. "You shouldn't have helped me." The moment the words left her mouth, Ethan's expression changed. Not anger, something deeper, sadder. "For 10 years, he said quietly, I convinced myself caring about people was weakness." Snow drifted across the windshield as the SUV stopped at a red light, and then you walked 6 miles through freezing rain just for a chance to survive. Rachel slowly looked at him. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. You reminded me who I used to be before money made everything transactional. The confession settled heavily between them, because beneath the billionaire reputation, beneath the tailored suits and guarded silence, Ethan Cole was lonely, deeply lonely, and somehow Rachel had begun seeing the man beneath the power long before he realized it himself. The SUV continued through snowy streets in silence. But this time the silence felt different, warmer, more personal. Rachel glanced toward Ethan briefly and noticed something she had never seen before. When he looked at her now, there was no distance left in his eyes. When they arrived at Cole Freight Systems, tension filled the building immediately. Employees whispered near elevators. Executives avoided eye contact. Everyone knew something serious was happening upstairs. Rachel's pulse pounded as she followed Ethan toward the executive boardroom. Outside the doors, Victor Hale waited quietly holding several folders. For once, even Victor looked uneasy. They're all inside, he said carefully. Ethan nodded once. Then Victor looked toward Rachel. His expression softened slightly for the first time since she met him. I was wrong about you. Rachel blinked in surprise. Victor exhaled slowly. I spent so many years believing hardship makes people unstable. He glanced down briefly. But you've handled pressure better than executives, making 10 times your salary. Rachel didn't know what to say. Finally, he added quietly, they're going to pressure Ethan hard in there. Rachel looked nervously toward the boardroom doors. Because of me? Victor hesitated, then answered honestly. No. He looked directly at Ethan. Because he changed. Silence followed, and Rachel understood exactly what Victor meant. Before her, Ethan ruled with logic alone. Now compassion had entered the room, and compassion changed people. Inside the boardroom, 12 executives sat around a massive glass table overlooking snowy Chicago. The atmosphere felt colder than the storm outside. One board member spoke immediately. This company cannot survive emotionally driven leadership decisions. Another slid documents across the table. Public risk exposure has increased since the fraud incident. A third executive looked directly at Rachel. With respect, Ms. Bennett represents instability. The sentence landed like a knife. Rachel lowered her eyes instantly. Instability, as if surviving poverty made her dangerous. Before she could speak, Ethan stood, and the room immediately fell silent, because everyone there knew one thing. Ethan Cole almost never lost emotional control publicly. But today, something was different. You built your careers helping me expand this company, Ethan said calmly. Warehouses, freight contracts, market acquisitions. He slowly looked around the room. And somewhere along the way, all of you forgot why I built it in the first place. No one interrupted. Ethan continued. My mother worked herself into exhaustion so I could escape poverty. She died before seeing any of this. His voice remained steady, but emotion lived underneath every word now. I spent 30 years believing success meant becoming untouchable. Then his eyes moved toward Rachel again, and this time he didn't look away. But strength isn't becoming untouchable. The room remained completely silent. It's refusing to lose your humanity after life gives you every reason to. Rachel felt tears filling her eyes instantly, because nobody had ever defended her like this before. Not publicly, not fearlessly. One executive finally spoke sharply. So, what exactly are you proposing, Ethan? Ethan didn't hesitate. We expand employee protection programs. Several board members frowned immediately. Emergency housing support, more silence, child care assistance. Now they looked stunned. And educational advancement opportunities for lower-income employees. One board member laughed softly in disbelief. You're talking about turning a logistics corporation into a charity. Ethan's eyes hardened instantly. No, his voice lowered slightly. I'm talking about building a company that remembers employees are human beings before their numbers. The room erupted into overlapping arguments. Too expensive, too risky, too emotional. Rachel stood frozen near the wall watching chaos unfold because of her existence. Then suddenly, Victor Hale stood up. The room slowly quieted. And Rachel stared in shock, because Victor never challenged the board publicly. Ever. I opposed Rachel Bennett's hiring from the beginning, Victor admitted calmly. Several executives nodded. But I was wrong. He looked around the room carefully. This woman walked 6 miles through freezing rain for an opportunity most candidates take for granted. Victor placed both hands on the table. She was framed, investigated, humiliated, and still showed more professionalism under pressure than half our management staff. Silence spread slowly across the boardroom. Then Victor said the one sentence nobody expected. If we punish people for surviving hardship, he looked directly at the board, then we deserve every failure coming to this company. Rachel covered her mouth as tears escaped, not because she felt weak, because after years of being treated invisible, people were finally seeing her value, really seeing it. 1 hour later, the meeting ended. The board had not approved every program Ethan proposed, but they approved enough. Rachel kept her job. Employee emergency assistance programs would begin immediately, and for the first time in company history, lower-level workers would receive family support benefits. Small changes, but life-changing ones. As executives slowly exited the boardroom, Rachel remained standing quietly beside the windows overlooking snowy Chicago. Her hands still trembled slightly from emotion. Ethan approached beside her. "It's over," he said quietly. Rachel laughed weakly through tears. "No," she whispered. "It feels like life is finally starting." For several seconds, neither spoke. The city lights reflected softly across the glass around them, while snow continued falling outside. Then Rachel looked toward him carefully. "Why did you really fight this hard for me?" Ethan stared out at the skyline for a long moment before answering. "Because one night I realized something." He turned toward her fully now. "The strongest person in my company," a faint emotional smile crossed his face, was a woman who arrived soaking wet, carrying her resume in a plastic grocery bag. Rachel laughed softly through tears. And suddenly both of them stood there smiling at each other in the quiet boardroom like two people who had survived different storms and somehow found shelter in the same place. Then Ethan stepped closer. Not enough to cross a line, just enough for the air between them to change. "You know," he said softly, "for someone who claims she's always afraid." His gray eyes held hers completely now. "You're the bravest person I've ever met." Rachel's breath caught slightly. No one had ever looked at her that way before. Not because of beauty, not because of perfection, but because of who she was. And somehow that meant more. Slowly, carefully, Ethan reached up and brushed a loose strand of damp chestnut hair away from her face. The movement was gentle, tentative, like even he was surprised by the tenderness in it. Rachel didn't pull away. For one suspended moment, the world outside disappeared completely. No board members. No billion-dollar company. No fear. Just two exhausted people standing close enough to finally admit something neither of them expected to feel. Then Lily's voice suddenly echoed from the hallway outside. "Mommy." Rachel laughed softly as the moment broke. Lily Bennett came running into the room, wearing her oversized pastel sweater and winter boots. Rachel immediately knelt and hugged her tightly. "Did you save your job?" Lily asked excitedly. Rachel smiled through tears. "Yes, baby." Lily grinned proudly. "I told you." Rachel laughed. "Told me what?" "That hard work matters." Rachel froze briefly, then looked up at Ethan standing only a few feet away. And this time when their eyes met, there was warmth there. Real warmth. Not spoken, not rushed, just the quiet beginning of something neither of them had been looking for. Hope. Outside the towering windows of coal freight systems, snow continued falling over Chicago, but for the first time in years, neither of them felt cold anymore. 3 weeks after the boardroom battle, Chicago finally stopped snowing. The city slowly returned to motion. Traffic filled downtown streets again. Delivery trucks crowded loading zones beneath skyscrapers. Morning commuters rushed through train stations carrying coffee and exhaustion in equal measure. And inside coal freight systems, something had changed. Not just policies. People. For the first time in years, employees on the operations floor actually smiled more. Conversations sounded lighter. Managers spoke differently to support staff. Human Resources had already approved emergency child care assistance for 3 warehouse workers. Small things. But small things change lives when you spent years surviving without them. Rachel Bennett noticed it everywhere. And somehow, every time she walked through the office now, people no longer looked at her like she didn't belong. They looked at her with respect. That frightened her almost as much as rejection once had, because respect meant visibility. And visibility meant people could eventually see how terrified she still felt inside. Thursday evening, Rachel remained at her desk reviewing shipment reports while soft sunset light poured across the operations floor. For once, she wasn't behind. In fact, she had finished her assignments early. Rachel stared at the screen suspiciously, almost waiting for disaster to appear. You know, Janice Miller said while passing her desk, most people celebrate when they finish work on time. Rachel laughed softly. I'm not emotionally prepared for stability yet. Janice grinned knowingly. Oh, honey, nobody in this building is. Rachel smiled, and for the first time in a very long time, the smile stayed. A few floors above her, Ethan Cole stood inside his office staring out across Chicago's skyline, while barely listening to the quarterly finance meeting happening behind him. Operational costs remained within projections. An executive continued. Ethan nodded automatically, but his attention drifted downward toward the operations floor below, toward Rachel. Again, Victor Hale noticed immediately. After the meeting ended and everyone else exited, Victor quietly closed the office door behind them. You're doing it again, he said. Ethan didn't pretend not to understand. She's good at her job, Ethan answered calmly. Victor almost smiled. That's not what I meant. Silence stretched briefly between them. Then Victor walked closer, toward the windows. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I haven't seen you this human in years. Ethan exhaled slowly. That sounds dangerously close to criticism. It's concern. Finally, Ethan looked at him. Victor folded his arms carefully. You're starting to care about someone whose life is very different from yours. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. I'm aware of that. Victor hesitated before speaking again. Then ask yourself one important question. Ethan waited. Victor's voice softened slightly. Are you helping Rachel because she needs saving? He glanced toward the operations floor. Or because being around her is saving you? The question stayed in Ethan's mind long after Victor left the office. Because deep down, he already knew the answer. That evening, Rachel arrived at Margaret Hayes' apartment, carrying grocery bags and one very important surprise. Lily Bennett opened the door immediately. Mommy. Rachel laughed as Lily nearly tackled her into the hallway. What happened? Lily asked excitedly. You look suspiciously happy. Rachel gasped dramatically. Suspiciously happy? That's what Miss Margaret says when game shows come on. Margaret laughed from the kitchen. Rachel knelt beside Lily and pulled a folded paper from her purse. What's that? Lily whispered. Rachel handed it over carefully. Lily read slowly with 6-year-old concentration. Then her eyes widened completely. You got the apartment? Rachel nodded. Lily screamed so loudly Margaret almost dropped the plate. For the next several minutes, Lily bounced around the tiny apartment shouting about bedrooms and windows, and a refrigerator that belongs to us. Rachel laughed until tears filled her eyes unexpectedly, because after months of instability, after eviction notices, shelters, borrowed rooms, and fear, they finally had somewhere to belong again. Later that night, after Lily fell asleep curled beside moving boxes, Rachel sat alone near the apartment window, staring out at Chicago lights. Her phone buzzed softly. Ethan. Rachel's heart reacted before her thoughts could. She answered quietly. Hi. For a brief second, neither spoke, and somehow the silence felt warm. Then Ethan said softly, Victor told me you got approved for the apartment. Rachel smiled instantly. News travels fast. It does when Lily apparently told half the lobby downstairs. Rachel laughed quietly. She's emotionally subtle. Ethan's low chuckle traveled softly through the phone, and Rachel suddenly became very aware of how much she liked hearing him laugh. Not because he was powerful, because he sounded lighter when he did. How's the place? Ethan asked. Rachel looked around the modest apartment. Old cabinets, tiny kitchen, second-hand furniture. Home. It's perfect. Ethan went quiet for a moment, then finally asked, "Are you happy?" The question caught her off guard. Not because it was difficult, because nobody had asked her that in years. Rachel leaned back slowly in her chair. "I think," she whispered carefully, "I'm learning how to be—" Silence again, but this silence felt different, more intimate, more dangerous. Rachel lowered her voice slightly. "What about you?" Ethan stood alone inside his penthouse office, overlooking the entire city. $1 billion skyline, awards on the walls, absolute silence, and somehow the loneliest room in Chicago. Then he thought about Rachel laughing with Lily, about grocery bags in tiny apartments and purple crayon notes, about warmth, real warmth. Finally he answered honestly, "I don't know yet." Rachel's chest tightened softly, hearing the vulnerability in his voice. Then Ethan surprised her. "Would you have dinner with me tomorrow night?" Rachel froze, not because she didn't want to, because she did. Too much. Her pulse quickened instantly, and suddenly every painful lesson life had taught her about trusting people came rushing back. Men with power complicated everything, especially kind men, especially lonely ones, especially ones who looked at her like Ethan did now. Rachel swallowed carefully. As co-workers? Ethan smiled faintly to himself. "That depends." "On what?" His voice lowered softly. "Whether you want this to feel like work." Rachel closed her eyes briefly, because somewhere along the way, without meaning to, the billionaire who watched her walk through rain had become the person she felt safest talking to, and that terrified her, but not enough to say no. A small smile touched her lips. "Okay," she whispered. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole smiled without forcing it, and neither of them realized it yet. But across Chicago, beneath city lights and healing hearts, two people who had spent years surviving alone were finally about to discover what it felt like to choose each other willingly.